Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
This happened a few years ago when I was road tripping with my best friend, Rachel. We were driving through a rural part of the state, mostly cornfields and tiny, run-down towns. It was late in the afternoon, and we still had hours to go before hitting the next motel on our route. Rachel was the one who spotted it, a carnival seemingly in the middle of nowhere. You know the type, faded tents, rusty Ferris wheel, peeling paint on the carousel horses. "Do you see that?" she asked, pointing out the passenger window. I slowed down to look. It didn't make sense. We hadn't passed any signs for a carnival, and this wasn't the kind of area you'd expect to find one. The theory was tucked back off the road, surrounded by overgrown grass. "Let's check it out," Rachel said, already unbuckling her seatbelt. I hesitated, but curiosity won out. We pulled onto the gravel path leading to the carnival. It looked like no one had been there in years, yet the lights on the rides flickered dimly, and faint music floated through the air, one of those tinny, old-timey carnival tunes. We got out of the car, and immediately something felt off. The air was too still. No birds, no bugs, not even a breeze rustling the grass. "Hello," Rachel called out. No answer. We wandered further in. The smell hit me first, like something rotting, faint but unmistakable. I grabbed Rachel's arm and maybe we shouldn't be here. She rolled her eyes. "Don't be such a wuss. It's just abandoned." Then we saw the ticket booth. A man was sitting inside, or at least, I think it was a man. His face was pale, almost chalk white, and he had this weird, too wide smile. He didn't say anything, just stared at us, his head cocked slightly to one side. "Huey ... look around," Rachel asked nervously. He didn't respond, just waved us in with a slow, deliberate motion of his hand. We walked deeper into the carnival, past the Ferris wheel and a row of game booths. There were prizes still hanging on the walls, stuffed animals covered in dust, their fur matted in gray. I swear I saw one of them blink. Rachel tugged me toward the carousel. "Let's take a picture," she said, pulling out her phone. As she raised it to snap a photo, the music stopped. The silence was deafening. "Okay, this is officially creepy," I whispered. Rachel nodded, lowering her phone. "Let's go." We turned to leave, and that's when we saw the figures emerging from the shadows, dozens of them, maybe more. They were tall and thin, their faces painted like clowns, but their eyes were completely black. "Rugged," I screamed, grabbing Rachel's hand. We sprinted back toward the car, but the path we'd come down was gone, replaced by a wall of carnival tents that hadn't been there before. The figures were closing in, moving in this jerky, unnatural way like puppets on strings. The smell of rot was overpowering now, and the flickering lights made it hard to see. Somehow, we found our way back to the car. I don't even remember how. I just remember slamming the doors, locking them, and peeling out of there as fast as the car would go. When we hit the main road, Rachel looked back. "It's gone," she whispered. I glanced in the rearview mirror. She was right. The carnival, the path, even the overgrown grass, all of it was gone. Just an empty field. We didn't talk about it again until we got home and looked at Rachel's phone. She hadn't taken any pictures, but there was a video, one neither of us remembered recording. It was just a few seconds long, shaky and blurry, but you could make out the Ferris wheel and the carousel ... and one of those clown-like figures standing impossibly close to the camera, its black eyes staring straight into the lens. I've always had a fascination with cemeteries. There's something peaceful about wandering among the headstones, reading the dates, imagining the lives of those long gone. It wasn't unusual for me to take a detour after work to visit old cemeteries in my area. One in particular, St. Marian's, was my favorite. It was secluded, overgrown in places, and so quiet that you could hear the faintest rustle of leaves. Last summer, I made it a habit to visit St. Marian's every Wednesday evening. The caretaker, a wiry old man named Joe, would often wave at me from the caretaker's shed. He had kind eyes and a grizzled beard, and he didn't seem to mind my presence. One evening, I arrived later than usual. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the graves. As I strolled among the headstones, I noticed something I hadn't before, a small, crooked mausoleum at the far edge of the property. It was partially hidden by a cluster of ancient trees, the stones so weathered it blended with the foliage. Curiosity got the better of me. I made my way over, the air growing noticeably colder as I approached. The mausoleum door was slightly ajar, and an unpleasant smell wafted out, a mix of damp earth and something metallic. "Hello," I called, thinking Joe might be nearby. No answer. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick and heavy, and my flashlight illuminated the walls, which were lined with small niches. Some held urns, others were empty, but what caught my attention was a pile of personal belongings in the center of the room: watches, wallets, glasses. They looked recent, not the kind of items you'd expect to find in a centuries-old crypt. A chill ran down my spine, and I decided it was time to leave. As I turned to go, I heard a faint scraping sound behind me. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the beam landed on something in the corner, a figure hunched in the shadows. "Joe," I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure straightened slowly, too tall and too thin to be the friendly caretaker. Its face was obscured by darkness, but I could hear its labored breathing, ragged and wet. I backed toward the door, but before I could reach it, the figure lunged. I screamed and bolted outside, running as fast as I could toward the caretaker's shed. Joe was there, sitting calmly in his chair, as though nothing was wrong. I must have looked insane, waving my arms and shouting incoherently, "There's someone at the mausoleum." I finally managed to choke out. Joe's expression didn't change. He sighed, got up, and grabbed a large, rusted machete from the wall. "Guess they got out again," he muttered, more to himself than to me. Before I could ask what he meant, he started walking toward the mausoleum. He didn't ask me to follow, but something told me to get out of there while I could. I sprinted to my car and didn't look back. The next morning, I checked the local news. No reports of anything unusual at St. Marian's. No mention of Joe. When I drove by later that day, the cemetery looked normal, except the caretaker's shed was gone, as if it had never been there. I haven't been back since. And to whoever or whatever was in that mausoleum, let's not meet. Ever. This happened a couple of years ago, but I still get chills thinking about it. For context, I used to live in a small town where everything closed early, except for one 24-hour laundromat on the outskirts of town. It was a sketchy place, flickery fluorescent lights, outdated machines, and an eerie vibe that made it feel frozen in time. One night, I realized I was out of clean clothes and had to do laundry. It was almost midnight, but I figured the place would be empty, so I grabbed my basket and headed over. When I got there, the parking lot was empty except for a beat-up white van parked on the far end. I didn't think much of it at first. Inside, the place was dead silent except for the low hum of the machines and the occasional clink of a coin dropping. I loaded my clothes, started the washer, and sat down in one of the plastic chairs by the folding tables. About 10 minutes in, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. There was a door in the back labeled employees only. It creaked open slightly, and I swear I saw a hand, just a hand, retract into the darkness. My stomach dropped, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. A few minutes later, I heard Fate whispering. It was soft and unintelligible, like multiple voices overlapping. It seemed to be coming from that back room. I glanced around, but I was still completely alone in the laundromat. Then the whispering stopped, and the silence felt heavier than before. I tried to focus on my phone, telling myself it was probably just pipes or the building settling. But then I noticed something even more unsettling. The white van outside was now parked closer, directly in front of the laundromat. My heart started racing. I thought about leaving, but my clothes were still in the washer. I told myself I was being paranoid and decided to wait it out. The final straw came when I glanced toward the employees only door again. This time, it wasn't just slightly ajar, it was wide open, revealing nothing but blackness. I stared at it, frozen, until I saw something step out. It wasn't a person. I can't describe it well because my brain refuses to make sense of what I saw. It was tall, with limbs that were too long and bent at wrong angles. Its skin, or whatever covered it, was pale and glistening, like raw meat. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, blank surface where a head should have been. I bolted. I didn't even grab my clothes. As I ran to my car, I could hear the door to the laundromat creak open behind me, followed by the sound of something scraping against the tiled floor. When I got in my car and locked the doors, I looked back at the laundromat one last time. The thing was standing just inside the glass doors, motionless, watching me, if it could even see. I sped home and never went back to that laundromat again. A few weeks later, I overheard someone in town talking about it. Apparently, the place had been shut down because of some code violations. I didn't ask questions. I've always been a night owl, and during my college years, I used to love studying late at night in the university library. The place had extended hours during finals week, staying open until 3 a.m., and it was usually quiet, save for a few fellow procrastinators. The library was huge, with multiple floors and rows upon rows of shelves that seemed to go on forever. It wasn't uncommon for entire sections to feel completely deserted, especially late at night. That's where I made my first mistake, choosing the basement. The basement level of the library was always less crowded. It housed the older, less used books and a few study carrels tucked between the stacks. It had an oppressive quietness, broken only by the occasional hum of the old fluorescent lights. But it was my favorite spot because I could study uninterrupted. One night, I was there around midnight, trying to cram for an exam. I'd been working for about an hour when I heard something strange, a faint whispering. It wasn't close. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere deep within the stacks. At first, I thought it was just another student talking to themselves or maybe on the phone. But the longer I listened, the stranger it became. The whispers were consistent. They would rise and fall, and sometimes it almost sounded like multiple voices overlapping. It was too far away for me to make out any words. I tried to brush it off, it kept working, but then I heard something that made me stop cold. My name. It was barely audible, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. Jess, the voice whispered. It sounded closer now, like it was coming from just beyond the row of bookshelves behind me. My heart started racing. I told myself I was imagining things, maybe I was overtired, but then I heard it again, louder this time. Jess, come here. I froze. I didn't recognize the voice. It was soft, almost melodic, but there was something deeply unnatural about it. I gathered my things, trying to stay calm, and decided to leave. As I stepped into the main aisle to head for the stairs, the lights flickered. It was just for a second, but it was enough to make me stop in my tracks. When the lights steadied again, I could see something at the far end of the aisle. It was a figure standing perfectly still. I couldn't make out any details. It was too far away, but it looked wrong. Its posture was slightly off, too tall and rigid, like it didn't know how to stand naturally. It wasn't moving, just standing there at the edge of the shadows. I didn't wait to get a better look. I turned and ran for the stairs, my heart pounding. As I climbed the steps 2 at a time, I could hear the whispers again, but now they were louder, echoing all around me. When I reached the main floor, the whispers stopped. The library was completely silent, as if nothing had happened. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing under the safety of the streetlights. I never went back to the basement after that night. A few weeks later, I overheard one of the librarians talking about how the basement was rumored to be haunted. Apparently, years ago, a student had gone missing down there late at night, and they were never found. This happened about 3 years ago when I was a graduate student. My university had a massive library that was open 24/7 during exam season. Most people avoided the late night hours, but for me, it was perfect. Quiet, empty, and free of distractions. Or so I thought. It was around 2 a.m. when I settled into a corner on the 3rd floor. The library's layout was kind of maze-like, with rows of shelves that stretched up to the ceiling and little nooks where you could sit undisturbed. I picked a spot near the back, surrounded by old books that probably hadn't been checked out in decades. I was working on a paper, headphones in, lost in concentration. About an hour passed before I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. I looked up and saw a man standing at the end of the aisle. He was just staring. He wasn't dressed like a student, no backpack, no books, just an oversized coat and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. I pulled out my headphones and gave him a nervous smile, hoping he'd move on. Instead, he turned and disappeared down another aisle. I told myself he was probably just wandering around, maybe a homeless guy looking for somewhere warm. The library was open to the public after all, but something about the way he'd been standing there sent a chill down my spine. I tried to focus on my work, but a few minutes later, I heard a faint tap 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 coming from behind me. I froze. The sound stopped. Slowly, I turned around, but the aisle was empty. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I packed up my things and decided to move to a more central area with better lighting. As I walked down the aisles, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him again. I reached the main study area, which was better lit but still deserted. There were a few security cameras, which made me feel a bit safer. I picked a seat facing the entrance and settled back in. About 10 minutes later, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was louder, more deliberate, like someone tapping their nails on a wooden surface. I scanned the room, but there was no one there. Then I saw it, a shadow flickering on the wall across from me. It moved, slow and deliberate, just out of sight. I grabbed my bag and stood up, my heart pounding. I was ready to bolt when I heard a whisper, low and raspy, like it was coming from right behind me. Why are you leaving? I didn't look back. I ran, full speed, all the way to the security desk near the entrance. The guard on duty was half asleep, but when I told him what happened, he immediately called for backup. They searched the library but didn't find anyone. No sign of the man, no tapping noises, nothing. The guard tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a prank or someone trying to scare me. But here's the thing, when they checked the security footage, it showed me sitting alone the whole time. No man in a coat, no shadow, nothing. This happened about a year ago, and it still makes my skin crawl to think about it. I was living in a small town at the time, stayed in a rental house with no washer or dryer. That meant weekly trips to the laundromat. Normally, I went during the day, but that week had been hectic, and by the time I got around to it, it was nearly midnight. The laundromat was in a strip mall on the edge of town. Most of the other businesses were long closed, and the parking lot was practically empty except for a few cars. probably belonging to the other late-night laundromat users. The lights inside were harsh and fluorescent, buzzing faintly as I looked in my basket. There were only two other people there, a woman folding clothes in the corner and a guy sitting near the dryers, scrolling on his phone. I picked a washer toward the back and started loading my clothes. Something about the place felt, maybe it was just the emptiness or the way the buzzy lights flickered occasionally. As I was stuffing my clothes into the machine, I heard a strange sound, like a low, guttural laugh. It echoed faintly, but when I glanced around, neither of the other people seemed to notice. The woman kept folding, and the guy didn't even look up from his phone. I shook it off as my imagination and started the machine. I sat down on one of the hard plastic chairs and pulled out my phone, trying to kill time while the washer ran. A few minutes later, I noticed the woman had finished folding her clothes and left. The guy by the dryers was still there, but now he wasn't on his phone anymore. He was staring straight at me. I looked away, pretending not to notice, but I could feel his eyes on me. After a moment, I glanced back, and he quickly shifted his gaze like he'd been caught. I told myself he was probably just zoning out or something, but then I noticed something even stranger. The dryers behind him were running. Not one or two, every single one. I hadn't seen him load any clothes, and there was no way he could have filled all of them. The sound of the spinning drums filled the laundromat, and for some reason, it made my stomach twist. I decided to get up and check my washer, even though it still had a while to go. As I stood, the guy suddenly got up too. He didn't say anything, didn't grab anything, just walked toward the door. Relief washed over me as he stepped outside, but then I realized he hadn't actually left. He was standing just outside the glass door, staring in. The fluorescent lights cast his shadow long and distorted, making him look taller than he was. I froze, unsure of what to do. A loud bang jolted me out of my thoughts. It came from the back of the laundromat, near the row of washers. I spun around, and all the machines were off except mine. The doors on the others were swinging open and shut, slamming with no apparent cause. The fluorescent lights flickered violently. I turned back to the front, but the man was gone. The parking lot was empty. My heart was racing as I grabbed my wet clothes from the washer, stuffed them into my basket, and bolted for the door. I didn't care that they weren't dry, I just wanted to get out of there. As I was loading my car, I looked back at the laundromat. The lights inside were still flickering, and through the glass, I saw something that made my blood run cold. All the dryers had stopped spinning, except one. In its circular window, I saw a reflection of the man standing behind me. I didn't turn around. I slammed the car door shut and drove off, my wet clothes forgotten in the back seat. A few years ago, my small suburban neighborhood held an annual garage sale event. It was a big deal for the community, with every house dragging out their unwanted items to the curb for a weekend of bartering and socializing. I had just moved in, so I decided to participate, figuring it would be a good way to meet people. The morning was bright and cheerful, the kind of day that makes you feel safe in the middle of the most mundane activities. My folding table was stocked with old books, DVDs, and some knickknacks from my parents' attic. As I set up, a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wandered up to my table. She was pale and thin, with long, stringy blonde hair that fell into her face. She wore a faded floral dress that looked like it belonged in another era. I smiled at her, but she didn't smile back. Her eyes, though, they were piercing. Not curious, like most kids, but cold and unblinking. "Do you have any dollhouses?" she asked. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, and I had to lean forward to catch her words. "Sorry, no dollhouses here," I said with a shrug. She stood there for a moment, staring at me as if she didn't believe me. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing down the street. I didn't think much of it, though I did glance around at my neighbors' tables to see if anyone else noticed her. No one seemed to. The day passed uneventfully until late afternoon when things began to wind down. Most of the other vendors were packing up, but I stayed out a bit longer, chatting with a neighbor. As we talked, I noticed the little girl again. She was standing at the end of my driveway, just watching me. This time, she wasn't alone. Beside her was an older man, tall and wiry, with deep-set eyes and a face so weathered it looked carved from wood. He was holding her hand, but it wasn't a comforting grip. It looked rigid, almost like he was holding her in place. His gaze locked onto mine, and a chill crept up my spine. "Is that your daughter?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't answer. Instead, he tugged the girl's hand, leading her away. But as they walked past, she turned her head and whispered something I couldn't make out. It sounded like, "You'll see." That night, I couldn't shake the unease. I told myself it was just a weird encounter, but the girl's voice echoed in my mind. "You'll see." The next morning, I I woke up early to clean up the remnants of the sale. When I stepped outside, I froze. Sitting in the middle of my driveway was a dollhouse. It wasn't mine. I had never seen it before. It was old and elaborate, with tiny, hand-carved furniture visible through the miniature windows. But it wasn't just the dollhouse that made my stomach drop. Inside, sitting at the miniature dining table, were tiny figures. They weren't dolls. They were crudely made figurines, carved from what looked like bone, and one of them looked exactly like me. I didn't touch it. Instead, I called the police, who came and examined the dollhouse. They seemed skeptical at first, but one of the officers noticed something that made his face go pale. Carved into the back of the house, almost imperceptible, were initials and a date. The initials matched mine, and the date was the same day I was born. I moved out of that neighborhood a month later. I still don't know who the girl or the man were, or how they knew anything about me. Let me preface this by saying I've never been someone who scares easily. I grew up in a small, safe town, and while I've read my fair share of creepy stories online, I've always chalked them up to overactive imaginations. But what happened to me last weekend has been replaying in my mind nonstop, and I feel like I need to share it. There's a local farmer's market that pops up every Saturday in the next town over. It's a charming little spot, homemade jams, fresh produce, handmade crafts, the kind of place where everyone seems to know each other. I've been meaning to check it out for months and finally decided to make the trip. It was a gorgeous day, sunny with just a slight breeze. The market was bustling but not overly crowded. I wandered through the stalls, sampling apple cider and admiring jars of honey. About halfway through, I noticed a stand I hadn't seen before. It was set up near the edge of the market, away from the main cluster of vendors. The table was covered in a dark red cloth, and various trinkets were arranged on it: old-fashioned keys, small glass bottles, and what looked like handcrafted dolls. The woman behind the table was, she looked to be in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her clothes were slightly outdated, like something out of a black and white photograph. But it was her eyes that unsettled me. They were an unnatural shade of pale gray, almost white, like she was blind. But she wasn't. I could feel her gaze tracking me as I approached. "Something catch your eye?" she asked, her voice raspy but warm, like a grandmother telling bedtime stories. I hesitated but nodded, picking up one of the small glass bottles. It was filled with a thick, dark liquid that seemed to shift as I tilted it. There was no label. "What's this?" I asked. She smiled, revealing teeth that were far too white and perfect for her age. "A remedy for protection." "And protection from what?" I joked, trying to lighten the mood. Her smile widened, and for a moment, I swore her pupils contracted like a cat's. "The things you don't say." I laughed nervously and set the bottle back down, but she reached out and placed a cold, bony hand on mine. "No charge. Take it. Feel made it." Every instinct told me to walk away, but there was something in her expression, a mix of urgency and pity, that made me take the bottle. I mumbled a thank you and quickly moved on, trying to shake off the unease. The rest of the market felt different after that. I noticed small things. Stalls I'd already passed seemed to be in different places, and the cheerful chatter of the crowd sounded distorted, like I was hearing it underwater. I decided it was time to leave. As I walked back to my car, I realized the parking lot was almost empty. I could have sworn it was packed when I arrived. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach as I fumbled for my keys. That's when I saw her. The woman from the stall was standing at the edge of the lot, partially obscured by the shadow of a large oak tree. She wasn't alone. There were 3 figures with her, tall and motionless, their faces hidden by dark hoods. They didn't move, but I felt their attention, sharp and invasive, like needles pricking my skin. I jumped into my car and locked the doors, my heart pounding as I started the engine. When I looked back, they were gone. The lot was empty. The drive home was a blur. I felt like I was being followed, but every time I checked my mirrors, the road was clear. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. I brought the bottle inside and placed it on the kitchen counter, intending to throw it away. But as soon as I let go of it, a sharp knock echoed through the house. It came from the back door. No one ever uses the back door. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The knock came again, louder this time. I grabbed a knife from the counter and crept toward the door. Through the window, I could see a figure standing just beyond the porch light. It was one of the hooded figures from the parking lot. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The back door was locked, and the bottle was gone. The only sign anything had happened was a single smudge on the glass of the back door, a handprint larger than any human hand I've ever seen. This happened 2 years ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. I was in college, a typical day of lectures and assignments, when I decided to grab lunch at the campus cafeteria. It wasn't my usual spot to eat. Usually, I'd take my food back to the dorm, but I had a gap between classes, and the cafeteria was quieter than usual. I grabbed a tray and scanned the room for an open table. Most of the ones near the windows were taken by cliques or groups studying together. Then I saw a nearly empty table near the back. A single guy sat there, hunched over a notebook, scribbling furiously. His hoodie was pulled up, and I couldn't see his face, but he seemed absorbed in whatever he was doing. I thought, perfect, he'll probably ignore me. So I sat down across from him, leaving a good amount of space between us. As I unwrapped my sandwich, I noticed something strange. He wasn't writing notes or doodling like I'd first thought. He was drawing faces, page after page, a sea of expressions, some twisted with anguish, others grinning in a way that made my stomach turn. I tried to focus on my food, but I couldn't help sneaking glances. His hand moved with unnatural speed, like he wasn't sketching so much as channeling something. I must have stared too long because suddenly he stopped. His pencil hovered mid-stroke, and without lifting his head, he turned the page, and there it was. It was May. My breath hitched. The sketch was unmistakably me, sitting at that table, holding my sandwich. Every detail, down to the pattern on my shirt. He hadn't even looked at me long enough to draw that. Before I could say anything, he finally looked up. His eyes were wrong, too wide, like he hadn't blinked in hours. His lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile, and he spoke in a voice that didn't match his face. It was too deep, too gravelly, like multiple voices layered together. "I've been waiting for you." I froze, sandwich halfway to my mouth, as his words echoed in my head. The cafeteria, though sparsely populated, suddenly felt suffocating. The chatter and clicking of plates seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I stammered, I think you've got the wrong person." He tilted his head, studying me like I was some kind of experiment. Slowly, he closed his notebook, the sound of the pages snapping together louder than it should have been. Then he slid the notebook toward me, his movements unnervingly deliberate. "I don't make mistakes," he said, his voice still carrying that unsettling depth. I didn't want to touch the notebook, but my hands moved on their own, trembling as I opened it. The sketch of me stared back, more detailed than before. My face wasn't just a sketch anymore, it looked lifelike, almost like a black and white photograph. But what made my blood run cold was the background. It wasn't the cafeteria, it was my dorm room. Every detail was there, my unmade bed, the poster on the wall, even the little stack of laundry I'd been putting off folding. My stomach churned, and how could he know? How could he have seen it? I glanced back at him, but he just sat there, grinning. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. "You already know." I didn't. At least, I didn't think I did. But something about him, it was like a memory just out of reach, like the sensation of trying to remember a nightmare after you wake up. I stood abruptly, the chair screeching against the tile floor. "Stay away from me," I said, my voice shaking as I grabbed my tray and started to back away. His grin widened. "You can't run from it. You know, it's already started." I turned and bolted, leaving my half-eaten sandwich and my tray on the counter as I rushed out of the cafeteria. My chest felt tight, and I could hardly breathe by the time I reached the safety of the crowded quad. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, trying to shake the feeling of his gaze burning into my back. When I finally returned to my dorm that evening, I hesitated at the door. My palms were sweaty, and every instinct screamed at me not to go inside, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, flipping on the light. At first, everything seemed normal. My bed was still unmade. My laundry still sat in a neat pile. The poster was still on the wall. I let out a shaky breath and stepped inside, closing the door behind me. That's when I noticed it. The notebook was sitting on my desk. I hadn't brought it with me. I left it in the cafeteria. My heart dropped as I slowly approached it, dread pulling in my stomach. It was open to a new page, and I didn't have to pick it up to see what was drawn there. It was me again, this time lying in my bed. My eyes were closed, and there was a dark figure standing over me, its face obscured by the shadows. Beneath the drawing, in jagged handwriting, were the words, "See you tonight." I've always loved Halloween. My neighborhood takes it seriously, with elaborate decorations, block parties, and hundreds of trick-or-treaters every year. But after what happened last year, I don't think I'll ever look at Halloween the same way again. It started off like any other October 31st. I decked out my house with fake cobwebs, a graveyard in the yard, and one of those animatronic skeletons that tells bad jokes. I was wearing a witch costume and handing out candy to kids. Everything was normal, festive, even until around 9 p.m. when the younger kids had mostly gone home. and the teenagers started roaming the streets. A group of 3 teenagers rang my doorbell. Their costumes were half-hearted. One was wearing a scream mask with a hoodie, another had vampire teeth, and the last just had a clown wig. I handed them candy, we exchanged the usual happy Halloween, and they wandered off down the street. Not 5 minutes later, the doorbell rang again. When I opened it, it was the same group of teenagers. Same costumes, same awkward stance. I laughed, thinking they were trying to double dip. Nice try, guys, I said. The one in the scream mask tilted his head slightly, like he didn't understand what I meant. Then, without a word, they turned and walked away. I chalked it up to them just being weird and shut the door. But then they came back, and again, and again. It didn't matter that I didn't open the door every time. They rang the bell over and over. Sometimes they'd knock instead, or tap lightly on the window. Always the same group, always silent. I texted my neighbor, Sarah, to ask if she'd seen them. She hadn't, but said she'd keep an eye out. Around 10 p.m., I'd had enough. I decided to turn off the lights and call it a night, hoping they'd move on. As I was locking the front door, there was another knock, louder this time. Angry, I flung the door open, ready to tell them off. But it wasn't the 3 teenagers anymore. It was just one, the scream mask. Except now, he wasn't wearing a hoodie, he was shirtless, his chest smeared with something dark. It looked like paint, but it smelled metallic, like blood. He stood there, motionless. I slammed the door and locked it, my hands shaking. I went to the back of the house to grab my phone and call the police. Before I could dial, I heard something tap against the sliding glass door. The scream mask kid was standing there, too. Except, no, that wasn't possible. He couldn't be in 2 places at once. My stomach dropped as I realized there wasn't just one scream mask. There'd be more, 4, 5, maybe more, all identical, all staring into the windows. I called 911, barely able to get the words out. The operator stayed on the line with me, assuring me help was on the way. I hid in the bathroom, trying to keep my breathing quiet. When the police arrived, the figures were gone. No sign of them, no muddy footprints, no candy wrappers dropped in the yard, nothing. The officers patrolled the neighborhood but didn't find anything suspicious. The next day, I asked around. None of my neighbors had seen them. Sarah swore no one had come to her house after 8:30. It was like they targeted me specifically. I thought maybe it was just a cruel prank, but then I checked my security camera footage. The footage showed me opening the door to no one at 9 p.m. and at 10 p.m. The scream mask wasn't shirtless, it wasn't there at all. After that Halloween night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder whenever I left the house, scanning the street for those masks or anything that seemed out of place. For weeks, nothing happened, and I started convincing myself that it really had been some weird prank. Maybe my mind had played tricks on me in the chaos. That was, until the package arrived on my doorstep. It was early December, a few weeks before Christmas. There was no return address, and the handwriting on the label was jagged, almost childlike. I hesitated, but eventually brought it inside and opened it. Inside the box was a scream mask, the same one I'd seen that night. Its surface was scuffed and stained, like it had been dragged through dirt, or worse. Underneath the mask was a folded piece of paper. The note said, in the same shaky handwriting, "This us." I dropped the box and immediately called the police. They came, took the box and the note as evidence, and promised to investigate. The officer who came to my house, a tall guy named Officer Ramos, tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a prank or some misguided attempt to scare me, but his tone didn't match his words. He looked worried. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every gust of wind outside made my heart race. Around 2 a.m., I finally dozed off, only to be jolted awake by a loud thud on my front porch. I stayed frozen in bed, listening. Another thud, and another. Then the sound of something being dragged across the porch, slow and deliberate. I mustered up the courage to peek out of the window from my bedroom. The street was empty, but my porch was locked. There were pumpkins, dozens of them, smashed to pieces, their guts spread across the porch and spilling onto the steps. In the middle of the mess was one intact pumpkin. It had been carved with a single word, "Soon." I didn't bother looking around for anyone this time. I called the police again. When they arrived, they found nothing, no footprints, no signs of anyone nearby, just the pumpkins. For the next few weeks, I barely left my house. I took time off work, had groceries delivered, and made excuses for why I couldn't meet up with friends. I even installed a second set of locks and motion sensor lights around my property. The nightmares started soon after. In them, I'd open my door to find dozens of scream masks staring at me, or I'd wake up to see one standing at the foot of my bed. Sometimes, I'd hear tapping on my windows, only to realize I was dreaming when I sat bolt upright, drenched in sweat. Then, on New Year's Eve, I received another package. This time, I didn't open it. I called the police immediately, and they came to take it away. They said they'd contact me when they had more information, but I never heard back. The worst part, the harassment didn't stop with the packages. Every so often, I'd find things in my yard, a single shoe, a pile of candy wrappers, or once, a broken cell phone that didn't belong to me. Each time, it felt like a message. message. A reminder, I don't know who they were or why they chose me. Maybe it was random, or maybe I did something that caught their attention. I'd since moved to a new town, far away from that neighborhood, and changed my phone number and even my name on social media. This happened about 3 years ago, but I still get chills thinking about it. I was 19 at the time and had just started volunteering at a small community center in my town. It wasn't anything fancy, just a place where people could take free classes, use the computer lab, or pick up donated items like clothes and food. I signed up to help out with an after-hours charity auction they were hosting one Friday night. The event ended around 9 p.m. and most of the guests had left by 9:30. My job was to help clean up the multipurpose room, which was on the first floor near the entrance. There were maybe 5 of us left: me, another volunteer named Sarah, 2 staff members, and an older man who had volunteered to help set up earlier but stayed late to assist with teardown. I hadn't seen him much during the event itself. He seemed nice enough, quiet and polite, probably in his late 50 seconds or early 60 seconds, with neatly combed gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He told us his name was Mr. Connors. I figured he was just one of those retirees who liked to stay busy. By 10 p.m., we had most of the cleanup done, and the staff members went upstairs to lock up the office. Sarah and I were left in the multipurpose room, folding up the last of the chairs. Mr. Connors was still there too, wiping down the tables. I glanced at him and noticed something strange. He was moving slowly, almost robotically, and staring at the same spot on the table as he wiped it over and over. I tried to brush it off as I'm being tired. Around 10:15, Sarah said goodnight and left. I was supposed to stick around until the staff came back downstairs, so I stayed behind to double check the chairs and tables. That's when I noticed something else. Mr. Connors wasn't cleaning anymore. He was just standing there, perfectly still, in the middle of the room. His back was to me, and he was facing the far corner. "Mr. Connors," I called out. No response. "Hey, are you okay?" Still nothing. I started to feel uneasy. The overhead lights flickered slightly, which wasn't unusual for the old building, but in that moment, it made everything feel 10 times creepier. I decided to text one of the staff members to let them know something was off. While I was typing, I heard a noise, a low, wet, gurgling sound. My heart dropped. I looked up, and Mr. Connors was facing me now, but his face, it wasn't right. His mouth was stretched unnaturally wide, like he was trying to form words but couldn't. His eyes were glassy, unblinking, and somehow darker than before, like they were absorbing the light. "Are you lost?" he said suddenly. His voice was raspy, broken, like it didn't belong to him. "Do you need help finding your way?" I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. He started walking toward me, each step deliberate and heavy. "Do you know where you are?" he asked again, his voice warping with each word. I bolted. I didn't even grab my bag. I just ran out of the room, up the stairs, and straight to the office. I banged on the door until one of the staff opened it. I was crying, trying to explain what had happened, but when they went downstairs to check, Mr. Connors was gone. The multipurpose room was empty, and the main doors were locked from the inside. Here's the thing, when I described Mr. Connors to the staff, they told me there was no one by that name on the volunteer list. No one matching his description had signed in or been approved to help with the event. To this day, I have no idea who or what I encountered that night. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It started small, just an uneasy sense of someone standing behind me when I was brushing my teeth or sitting at my desk. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. After all, I hadn't actually been hurt. Maybe my brain was just playing tricks on me. But things got worse. About a week later, I was walking home from a friend's house around dusk. It was a clear evening, the kind where shadows stretch long and dark across the sidewalk. I was halfway down my street when I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, echoing mine. I turned around, expecting to see one of my neighbors. Instead, I saw him, Mr. Connors, or whatever he was. He was standing about 20 feet away, under a streetlight, perfectly still. His face was blank, his expression eerily calm, but his eyes, they were just as dark and empty as before. "Are you lost?" he asked again, his voice carrying down the quiet street like a whisper and a shout at the same time. My stomach turned. I didn't say anything. I just turned and started walking faster. The footsteps followed, not rushing, not running, just that same slow, deliberate pace. I broke into a sprint, my heart hammering in my chest, but the footsteps never sped up. Somehow, they still sounded close, too close. I made it to my house, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I stood there, panting, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no knock, no sound at all. I peeked through the peephole. The street was empty. For the next few nights, I barely slept. I kept checking my windows and doors, making sure everything was locked. My rational brain tried to tell me it was just paranoia, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Then, 3 days days later, I found a piece of paper slipped under my door. It was folded in half, with my name written on the front in neat, looping handwriting. I unfolded it, my hands trembling. The note was simple, just 4 words, "Do you know yet?" I don't know how to explain it, but I felt like the words were sinking into my skin, crawling under it. I tore the note into tiny pieces and flushed it down the toilet, hoping that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next few weeks, more strange things happened. My phone would buzz in the middle of the night, but when I checked, there was no notification. Lights in my house would flicker, even though the wiring had always been fine. Once, I woke up to find my front door standing wide open, even though I know I had locked it before bed. And then there were the whispers. Late at night, just as I was falling asleep, I'd hear them. Faint, unintelligible murmurs coming from the corners of my room or the hallway outside my door. I never understood what they were saying, but they always left me with the same sickening question: do you know yet? I don't know what I'm supposed to know. I don't know why this is happening to me. I moved to a new apartment, changed my phone number, and even stopped using my real name online. It helped for a while. Months went by with no incidents, and I started to believe maybe I'd escaped him. Until last night, I was coming home late from work, walking up the path to my building when I saw it. A single piece of paper pinned to my door. No note this time, just a rough sketch of a dark, empty room. In the corner of the drawing, barely visible, was a figure, a tall, thin man with glasses, standing perfectly still. I don't know how he found me. I don't know what he wants. All I know is, I don't think I can outrun him anymore. If you ever meet someone who seems just a little too quiet, a little too off, trust your instincts. And if they ever ask, "Do you know yet?" don't answer. This happened about 10 years ago, but I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I was 17 at the time, and my friends and I were the kind of teenagers who loved to explore creepy places just for the adrenaline rush. It wasn't the smartest hobby, but we were young and thought we were invincible. There was an old amusement park about an hour outside of town that had been shut down for decades. The story was that it closed after a string of freak accidents, fires, ride malfunctions, that kind of thing. It was boarded up and fenced off, but people in our town loved to share ghost stories about it. Naturally, we decided we had to check it out. One Saturday night, 4 of us, me, my best friend Kelly, and 2 other friends, Jake and Marcus, drove out there. We parked a little ways down the road and snuck through a gap in the fence. The place was even creepier than I'd imagined. Rusted rides loomed like skeletons in the dark, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and burnt wood. The only sounds were the occasional creak of metal in the wind and the crunch of gravel under our feet. We wandered around for a while, shining our flashlights on old ticket booths and faded signs. I remember laughing nervously, trying to act braver than I felt. Jake dared us to climb the rickety roller coaster tracks, but none of us were stupid enough to try. Instead, we made our way to the Ferris wheel, which was still mostly intact, though it leaned slightly to one side. As we got closer, I noticed something odd. One of the gondolas was gently swaying, even though there was no breeze. "It's probably just the wind," Kelly said, but she didn't sound convinced. Then we saw a man standing next to the Ferris wheel, partially hidden in the shadows. He was tall and thin, wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in darkness. At first, I thought he might be a security guard, but something about him didn't seem right. He didn't move or say anything. He just stood there, watching us. "Hey," Jake called out, trying to sound tough. "We're just looking around. We'll leave if it's a problem." No response. The man didn't even flinch. Kelly grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Let's just go," she whispered. But Jake and Marcus weren't ready to back down. "What's your problem, Dewey?" Marcus shouted, taking a step toward him. That's when the man finally moved. He was subtle at first, a tilt of his head, like he was sizing us up. Then he stepped out of the shadows, and my stomach dropped. This face, it wasn't right. His features were sharp and stretched, like his skin was too tight over his skull. His eyes were wide and glassy, reflecting the beam of Jake's flashlight in a way that made them look unnaturally bright. "Do you want a ride?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. He gestured to the Ferris wheel with one long, bony hand. None of us answered. We were frozen, staring at him. He tilted his head again, as if confused. "You came all this way," he said, a smile creeping across his face. "Why not stay for a while?" That was all it took. Kelly and I turned and bolted, dragging Jake and Marcus with us. We didn't stop running until we were back at the fence, scrambling through the gap and diving into the car. As we sped away, I looked back and saw him standing by the Ferris wheel again, his hand raised in a slow wave. We never went back, but a few weeks later, I heard a rumor that a couple couple of kids had been caught sneaking into the amusement park. One of them claimed they'd seen a man by the Ferris wheel who had offered them a ride. The other kid refused to talk about it, but he looked pale and shaken whenever the subject came up. For weeks after that night, I couldn't get the man's face out of my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his stretched, unnatural smile and those glassy, glowing eyes. Kelly and I barely talked about it. She said she didn't want to give it power by thinking about it too much. Jake and Marcus laughed it off like it was some kind of prank, but I could tell they weren't as unaffected as they pretended to be. Something about that night had rattled all of us. Then the dreams started. At first, they were vague, just flashes of the amusement park, the rusted rides, and the swaying Ferris wheel. But they got worse. In one dream, I was standing at the base of the Ferris wheel, staring up at the gondolas. One of them creaked open, and I saw the man inside, his skeletal hand beckoning me to come closer. His voice echoed in my head, low and insistent, "Come take a ride." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The dreams kept coming, more vivid each time. One night, I dreamt I was strapped into one of the gondolas, the wheel creaking and groaning as it turned. The man sat across from me, smiling that grotesque smile. As the gondola rose higher, I looked down and realized the ground was gone. Below me was nothing but a yawning, black void. When I told Kelly about the dreams, she went pale. I've been having them too, she admitted. But it might. He's not at the park anymore. He's in my house. That sent a chill down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was just our imaginations running wild, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something had followed us from that place. A few nights later, it escalated. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard a faint creaking noise. It was rhythmic, like the sound of a swing moving back and forth. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, but when I sat up, I realized it was coming from inside the house. My blood turned to ice. I forced myself to get out of bed and follow the sound, even though every instinct screamed at me to stay put. The creaky led me to the living room. At first, everything seemed normal, just a dark, empty space lit only by the glow of a street lamp outside. But then I saw it. In the corner of the room, my rocky chair was moving, back and forth, slow and steady, as if someone invisible was sitting there. And then, just for a moment, I caught a glimpse of something, a tall, shadowy figure standing behind the chair, its face obscured but its presence unmistakable. I ran back to my room, slammed the door, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I called Kelly and begged her to meet me. We needed to figure out what was going on. She agreed, but when I showed up at her house, she looked worse than I'd ever seen her, pale, exhausted, and jumpy. "It's getting worse," she whispered. "I keep seeing him in the mirrors. And last night, I swear I heard him outside my window." We decided to tell Jake and Marcus. If all of us were experiencing something, maybe we could piece together what was happening. But when we called them, neither of them picked up. We drove to Marcus's house first, and his mom told us he hadn't come home the night before. When we got to Jake's place, his car was in the driveway, but he didn't answer the door. Eventually, Kelly found a way in through the unlocked back door. I stayed in the living room while she called out for him. A moment later, I heard her scream. I ran upstairs and found her in Jake's bedroom. The walls were covered in frantic scribbles, written in what looked like black marker. Over and over, he'd written the same phrase, "Come take a ride." Jake was nowhere to be found. We never saw him or Marcus again. The police said they were probably just runaways, but I know better. Whatever we unleashed that night, it took the time, and now I think it's coming for us. Kelly and I don't talk anymore. She moved out of town a few months after everything happened. Last I heard, she was seeing a therapist, trying to cope with the nightmares that still haunted her. As for me, I've done everything I could to move on, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sound of creaky metal, and every now and then, I see a figure in the distance, a tall man in a wide-brimmed hat, watching me. If you ever hear about an abandoned place and think it would be fun to explore, don't. Some things should be left alone, and if you ever see a Ferris wheel swaying when there's no wind, for the love of God, don't go near it. I used to work at a small, historic theater in my town. It wasn't a glamorous job, just managing the ticket booth and occasionally handling concessions during intermissions. The place had been around since the 1920s, and while it had a certain charm, it was. Everyone who worked there had stories about the theater. Some people swore they'd hear whispers in the empty seats after a show, or see shadows moving in the aisles when the lights were dimmed. I'm not one for ghost stories, but after a few months of working there, even I started to feel uneasy. One night, I was scheduled to close the theater after a special late night screening. It was a classic horror movie marathon, which felt ironic considering how creepy the theater already was. By the time the last guests left, it was nearly 2 a.m. My coworker Mike, who was supposed to help me lock up, bailed earlier in the night, leaving me to close alone. The theater was eerily silent as I made my rounds. I locked the front doors, checked the bathrooms, and made sure all the projectors were off. Finally, I entered the main theater to turn off the lights. The room was massive, with rows upon rows of old, creaky seats and a faint smell of mildew lingering in the air. As I reached the light switch near the stage, I heard a noise behind me. It sounded like footsteps. I froze, my heart racing. Hello, I called out, my voice echoing in the empty room. No response. I brushed it off as my imagination. After all, I'd been hearing about this place being haunted for months, and it was easy to let your mind play tricks on you. I flipped the switch, plunging the theater into darkness. That's when I heard it again, soft, deliberate footsteps, but this time they were closer. I turned on my phone flashlight and swept it across the room. Nothing. The seats were empty and the aisles were clear. I told myself it was just the old building settling and hurried toward the exit. As I passed the concession stand on my way out, I glanced back into the theater lobby. That's when I saw her. A woman stood at the top of the staircase that led to the balcony seating. She was partially obscured by shadows, but I could make out her long, dark hair and pale skin. She wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. "Ma'am, the theater is closed," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You'll have to leave." She didn't respond. She didn't move. Her head tilted slightly, as if she were studying me. I wasn't about to go up there alone, so I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining that someone was still in the building after hours. They assured me someone would be there soon. I stayed near the front door, keeping an eye on the staircase. The woman didn't move. She didn't even flinch. When the police arrived, they searched the building from top to bottom. The balcony, the bathrooms, even the backstage area. They didn't find anyone. One of the officers suggested that maybe I had just been seeing things. Exhaustion, shadows playing tricks on my mind, that sort of thing. But I knew what I saw. That woman was real. I quit the theater a week later. Whatever or whomever she was, I don't ever want to see her again. After I quit the theater, I did my best to move on. There was an exit. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned a corner or walked into a dark room, I half expected to see her standing there. I told myself it was just lingering paranoia, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. About a month later, I bumped into Mike, the coworker who had bailed on me that night. We hadn't spoken since I left the theater, but I figured he might appreciate hearing my side of the story. Over coffee, I told him everything, the footsteps, the woman, how she just stood there like a statue. Mike's face went pale. He put down his cup and leaned in, lowering his voice. "Did she look wrong?" he asked. "What do you mean?" "Like, her face wasn't quite normal, too pale, her eyes too dark." His voice was shaking now. Chills ran down my spine. "Yeah, kind of," I said hesitantly. "Why?" Mike sighed and sat back, rubbing his hands over his face. I didn't want to say anything before, but I saw her too, about a year ago. My stomach dropped. "What?" "When?" "One night after closing. I was cleaning up the balcony seats after a show. Everyone else had already left, and I was the only one there, at least I thought I was. I saw her sitting in the back row. I figured she was a straggler who hadn't left yet, so I walked over to tell her we were closed. But when I got closer, she just disappeared." I stared at him, unable to speak. He continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told the manager, but he brushed it off, said it was just my imagination." I didn't believe him. After that, I couldn't work alone at night anymore. Every time I was in the building by myself, I felt like she was there, watching me. Mike and I sat in silence for a while, both of us lost in our thoughts. Finally, I asked the question that had been nagging at me since that night. "Do you think she is a ghost?" Mike hesitated. "I don't know, but whatever she is, I don't think she's harmless." I didn't want to believe him, but I couldn't deny the sinking feeling in my gut. After that conversation, I started noticing things, small, unsettling coincidences that made me question whether I'd really left her behind. It started with the sound of footsteps in my apartment late at night. At first, I thought it was my upstairs neighbors, but the noises didn't match. They weren't muffled thumps. These were sharp, deliberate steps, like someone pacing back and forth. Then there were the whispers. I could never make out the words, but they sounded faintly familiar, like an echo of something I'd heard before. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom window wide open. I never opened it. The air outside was freezing, but the room felt stiflingly hot, like someone had been standing there, breathing heavily. The worst came a few weeks later. I was driving home from work late at night when I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. It was faint, but I swear I saw a figure sitting in the back seat, long, dark hair, pale face, staring directly at me. I slammed on the brakes and whipped around, but the back seat was empty. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I drove straight home, locked every door and window, and sat in my living room with every light on until sunrise. I don't know what she wants, or why she's following me. I've tried everything to get rid of her, blessing my apartment, burning sage, even seeing a psychic. Nothing has worked. All I can do now is hope she'll lose interest and move on. But every night, as I lie in bed listening to the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway, I can't help but wonder, what if she never leaves? A few years ago, I worked as a security guard at a small, family-run amusement park in my hometown. The place had been a local treasure in the 90 seconds but had shut down a decade earlier when attendance plummeted. Rumors about accidents and mismanagement circulated, but I was never sure what really led to its closure. My job was simple: patrol the grounds during the overnight hours to deter vandals or trespassers. The park was eerie even during the day, with rusted rides and faded paint peeling from cartoonish mascots. At night, it was suffocatingly silent, save for the occasional creak of a decaying structure swaying in the wind. I usually kept to my little booth by the entrance, passing the time with podcasts and crossword puzzles. That night, however, a motion sensor near the old funhouse triggered an alert on my tablet. I sighed, grabbed my flashlight, and headed out to investigate. The funhouse was my least favorite part of the park. Its gaudy, smiling clown face at the entrance had decayed into something far more sinister over the years. One of its eyes had fallen off, leaving a gaping black hole, and the jagged teeth looked ready to snap shut. Still, I told myself it was probably just a raccoon or stray cat setting off the sensor. The air inside was stale, and my boots crunched on broken glass and debris. My flashlight cut through the darkness, highlighting distorted mirrors and faded murals of laughing children. As I made my way deeper into the funhouse, I heard something that made me freeze, faint, uneven footsteps echoing through the halls. Hello, I called out, trying to sound authoritative but failing to mask the tremor in my voice. This is private property. You need to live. The footsteps stopped. I waited, straining to hear any movement, but the silence pressed against my ears. I took a step forward, and the sound of my own footfall seemed deafening. Just as I was about to turn back, I caught a flicker of movement in one of the distorted mirrors to my left. It was faint, but I saw what looked like a figure, a person, and possibly thin and long-limbed, slipping around a corner. Heart pounding, I pointed my flashlight toward the mirror and then the hallway behind me, but no one was there. Swallowing my fear, I quickened my pace, determined to check the rest of the funhouse and get out as quickly as possible. I turned a corner into the room with the spinning tunnel, a disorienting cylinder painted in garish colors. The motor that used to rotate it had long since broken, but the platform still felt precarious underfoot. As I stepped inside, I heard a loud clang from behind me, like something heavy had dropped onto metal. Whipping around, I saw that the tunnel's entrance was blocked by the rusted clown head from the facade. I don't know how it got there. It was far too big for one person to move alone, but it sat there, its one remaining eye gleaming in the beam of my flashlight. Panic sudden, I turned to run through the other side of the tunnel, only to see someone, or something, standing at the exit. It was the figure I'd seen in the mirror, hunched unnaturally. Its head was tilted at an angle that shouldn't have been possible, and its face was obscured by shadows. It moved toward me in a jerky, unnatural way, as if it were being puppeteered by invisible strings. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, it was morning, and I was lying on the pavement outside the funhouse. The park's owner found me when he arrived to relieve me from my shift. I quit that day and never looked back. A few months later, the park was demolished to make way for a shopping center. Part of me felt relieved, but the rest of me wondered what would happen to the thing that had made its home there. A few weeks after I quit, I started having dreams about the park. At first, they were just vivid memories, walking the grounds, hearing the hum of old rides, feeling the damp, sticky air of the funhouse. But as the dreams progressed, they became something else. In one, I was standing in front of the funhouse again, except the clown's face was pristine, its colors bright and new. The missing eye was back, but it wasn't painted, just a gaping void that seemed to draw me in. The figure was always there in these dreams, lurking at the edge of my vision. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. I'd wake up drenched in sweat. The image of its twisted posture burned into my mind. One night, the dream changed. Instead of the funhouse, I was in my own apartment. The air was heavy, oppressive, and I couldn't move. I heard the faint echo of footsteps, uneven and deliberate, coming from somewhere in my home. My bedroom door creaked open slowly, and I saw the figure standing there, its head tilted at that impossible angle. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It just stood there, watching me until I jolted awake. After that night, I started noticing strange things around my apartment. Objects would be moved, small things, like a coffee cup I left on the counter being in the sink the next morning, or my keys turning up in places I hadn't left them. I chalked it up to stress at first, but the feeling of being watched never went away. One night, while I was watching TV, my motion sensor alarm app went off. The tablet I'd used for the job was still synced to the park system, even though it had been demolished months ago. My heart dropped as I stared at the alert, motion detected, funhouse. I dismissed it as a glitch. The system must have been picking up stray data from the nearby construction site, but the alerts kept coming, each one more specific than the last. Motion detected, tunnel. Motion detected, mirror hall. Motion detected, office. I turned the tablet off and shoved it in a drawer, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my chest. That night, I dreamed again. This time, the figure wasn't in the funhouse or my apartment, it was in my living room. It stood by the window, motionless, staring out at the city. I woke up with a start. My breath ragged, and instinctively turned toward my bedroom door. It was open. I distinctly remember closing it before going to bed. My stomach dropped as I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, but before I could dial, I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Slow, uneven, deliberate. Gripping my phone like a lifeline, I crept toward the door, heart pounding. The hallway was empty, but a chill ran down my spine as I noticed something on the floor, a single, dirty footprint leading away from my bedroom. It was larger than any human footprint I'd ever seen, and the shape was rugged. The toes were elongated, almost claw-like, and the arch seemed unnaturally high. I didn't sleep that night. I packed a bag and left for a motel, too scared to stay in my own home. Over the next few days, I stayed with friends, telling them I had a pest problem I needed to deal with. I couldn't bring myself to explain what was really happening. Who would believe me? The final straw came a week later. I'd gone back to my apartment during the day to grab a few things. As I walked into the living room, I froze. Sitting on my coffee table was an old, tattered flyer for the amusement park, dated the year it had closed. Scrawled across it in smeared black ink were the words, USHOULD and have left. I moved out that same day, breaking my lease and losing most of my deposit in the process. I didn't care. I just wanted to be as far away from that place as possible. It's been years now, and I've tried to put it all behind me. I live in a new city under a new name, and I've told myself it's over. But sometimes, late at night, I'll catch a faint whiff of stale air, or hear the faintest echo of uneven footsteps outside my window. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.